Hi, Michelle Atkinson again, back for part two of Water Florida Lifeblood. And in this presentation, we're going to talk about water quality. So, what Americans think about water quality and water quantity. So, when our University of Florida PI, which is an area that does a lot of surveying, determining where we should direct our focus, they found across America, the number three extreme important issue is water. So people are worried about the economy, they're worried about healthcare, and then water. So it is a hugely important issue to many folks. In Florida, we classify our different water resources differently, and each of them have different regulations on them. So of course our class one potable drinking water is highly regulated. They're constantly monitoring, sampling, and it has to meet regulation before it can be pumped out into the pipes to the public. Class two is our shellfish, and so we have to be very careful where our shellfish farms are because we ingest the shellfish and they are filter feeders, and we want to make sure that their water quality is a good level so that we're not ingesting bacteria and things like that. So just to show you the different levels, class five is like our navigational waters and all. So any named body of water in this area, like the Manatee River, the Braden River, anything that's a named or navigable body of water has not been as regulated and as these other areas until about the 90s, the 1990s. And so that's when it really started to be looked at and some standards started coming in place legislatively. So why? Well, we had a lot of impaired water bodies here in Florida. And I'm a Florida native. I've mentioned this, I'm sure, but I'm a Florida native. I'm a native to Manatee County. Manatee County has a body of water called the Palmasola Bay area, and that Palmasola Bay area used to get closed every summer for weeks at a time because of high bacteria levels. That was when I was growing up and in high school, so that was 30 years ago. But yes, it was constantly being shut down, and we've improved. It's more of a rarity now that that body of water gets shut down for bacteria levels. So what we're doing is working. It is starting to work, and it's been working. We've actually had some bodies of water here in Manatee County that were classified impaired, which means that it didn't meet the water criteria levels set for it. So every body of water has a level that it's levels that it's allowed to have of pollutants. Once it goes over that level, then it's considered an impaired body of water. So if it has the things that we're looking for are listed here: nitrogen, phosphorus, the dissolved oxygen, fecal coliform, mercury. Those are things that are being watched. There are some other pollutants out there, but they don't necessarily get monitored. And this is something that can be added to. I know that there was some talk because copper sulfate is a very common fungicide that's used for, or algicide that's used in stormwater ponds. And levels of copper were showing up in Charlotte Harbor area. And so they were talking about putting that on the list as a, one of those things that if the level gets too high, then they'll call that body of water impaired. So again, this is kind of this regulation really ramped up in the 90s, started coming in place, 2000, 2010, we started seeing they were marking more these impaired bodies of water. And once it's impaired, then we have to do something about it. So the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the DEP, is who's heavily involved with this monitoring and this whole process. So when they say you have an impaired body of water, they also say, what are you going to do about it? And so that's when we look to these things called Basin Management Action Plans, or BMAPs, they're commonly referred to. And so a BMAP is the blueprint or the plan of how we're going to improve that water quality in that body of water. So what are we going to do? So let's see. We've got Manatee County right here. This is my county, so I'm a little familiar with it. And we have number 8. So the Manatee River Basin is listed on here as an adopted BMAP. So we do have a Basin Management Action Plan for the Manatee River area because there were a couple of bodies of water, tributary bodies of water, that were considered impaired. And so we had to figure out how we were going to clean that water up, and reduce that. We're pretty fortunate that we just have this one little guy here. Look at across the state, the BMAPs that are in place. This is a planning process. This is what brought the Manatee County Fertilizer Ordinance into play. That was one of the tactics that they put into the Basin Management Action Plan, or the BMAP, as a way to help us clean up our water bodies. Not only does it address fertilizer applications, but it also addresses grass clippings, which I'll talk more about later. Agriculture is also listed in these blueprints and these BMAPs. They can enforce ag to do different things. I know over where they grow potatoes in this part of the state, and I'm not thinking of the name of the county right now, but it's a huge area for growing potatoes. The BMAP that they put in place actually told them how much fertilizer they could use in their growing processes, capped the amount of fertilizer that they could use. And unfortunately, the potato growers didn't feel like that was enough to meet their contracts, and so lawsuits started. And I believe the BMAP stuck, though, and the potato producers had to follow those guidelines. So it can also address things like fencing out cattle from water bodies, which is supposed to be done anyway as a best management practice. Creating swales, things done with manure. It can address a lot of different tactics or best management practices in this BMAP. So it's, the guide of this is what we're going to do to change it. So what happens if we put a BMAP in place and we don't enforce our BMAP, or we don't improve our water body? Then fines start coming. And no government entity wants to pay fines, because these aren't little teeny tiny fines. These are hefty fines. So they start fining you. And so you'll figure out a way to make it happen. Also, the government itself works to clean things up, like with sewage treatment. Sometimes there's better ways to do it, and so things get put in place to help reduce the nitrogen loading that comes from that process as well. Well, let's talk about the different types of pollution that can cause these impairments or, poor water quality. One is what we call point source pollution, and that is we can point to something and say, this is the problem. This is what's causing this issue. And in the picture, you're seeing some very dirty water coming out. Maybe that's an industrial park there, and some process has this tainted water that comes off of it and discharges into this canal situation. So this can be tested, and that company can be fined, or that company can be told to clean it up and fix it. So that's point source. That's a lot easier to manage and control, of course, because you know the source of the pollution and you can, work to fix that. The bigger problem is non-point source pollution. We don't know who the issue, the actual polluter is, and it's not going to be just one polluter. It's many, many polluters. So when it's non-point source pollution, if you're in an agricultural area and you have a lot of different farming practices, it could be manure, it could be fertilizer, whatever coming off of the farm can pollute the water. Septic tanks are a huge source of nitrogen coming into our water bodies. So septic tanks, and there's no like one septic tank that is probably the problem. It's probably many that aren't in good working order or aren't properly installed, and so they're creating problems. Stormwater runoff, as you can see in these photos, and this is showing a lower class development versus a higher class income level development. So a low income level development versus a high income level development, it doesn't matter. There's still a lot of concrete, there's still a lot of rooftop, there's not a lot of turf and not a lot of landscape to take up water when it comes down. So when it rains and it rains good, where's the water going to go from here? And what's it going to pick up with it when it moves? I see a lot of cars on the right. I see a lot of trash on the left. So either way, those cars, can leak oil, gas. The turf grass there looks well manicured, so grass clippings, maybe fertilizer. So either one of these, it doesn't matter your income level, either one of these can create pollution problems. So urban development can, really add to this pollution problem because we don't always have the proper processes in place to take care of the pollution before it enters the bodies of water. Pet waste is another one. I work with a water researcher who was sampling a stormwater pond kind of locally, and they kept getting really high readings of nitrogen in this one area of the pond. And so they started tracing uphill, right? You go up the watershed and find out what's happening. Why is this water coming in like this? And it turns out that the homeowner that lived right behind that area had two rather large Labradors and let them go in the backyard and didn't pick up the waste. And so when when it rained or irrigation, overflow irrigation runs off too, just like stormwater, it was pushing that nitrogen down into the pond, and they had like a hot spot right there where that house was. So you may not realize the amount of nitrogen that comes in from pet waste, but it can be pretty significant. All right, so septic systems. There are over 2 million septic systems in Florida. A lot of these septic systems are near our springs, and that's created some problems for our springs that we've found out. So we've been working hard to find out some other ways, some other methods that we can use, because septic systems are estimated to contribute hundreds of thousands of pounds of nitrogen into groundwater each year. So, there's got to be a better way that we can do things, and we're starting to find that there is. And one of those ways is something that UF has been looking at. It's an in-ground nitrogen reducing biofilter. So it kind of works with your existing septic tank. You have your septic tank here, and then you have your discharge. So what typically happens is your solids settle down, excess water comes out into a drain field area. So what this is basically an improved drain field area. So you want to, always make sure everything's in good working order, that your drain field is kept clear, so that the water can do what it needs to do. But typically in the drain field, it's just rock. So they just put some rock here, the water comes out through here and then kind of settles down. But in this improved drain field area, it has some different types of soils and wood chips. So as that water settles down or percolates down into the soil, it is attaching the pollutants, or it's attaching the pollutants to some of these organic materials, but it also is going through some processes to remove the nitrogen through like denitrification processes. So this is something that they've researched, and it has been approved through the state. There are, in the spring areas, at least there was, I don't know, if it's still available, but there was money available for people to retrofit their septic systems, for processes like this to help reduce the nitrogen that's going into the groundwater, because then it comes out our springs, and when we have excess nitrogen in our springs, then we have algae problems, and so that's been a real problem here. So our conventional septic systems were not designed to remove the nitrogen and phosphorus, the pharmaceuticals, or personal care products. They were designed basically to remove the solids. So that's what they were set up for. This is a very old technology, and there's always room for improvement. So something that you need to think about if you do have a septic system is, because of COVID, there's been a lot more wipes going into the system. So disinfecting wipes that might be used on the toilet surface, or in the bathroom itself, or wipes for your personal hygiene. Even though they're labeled flushable, they're not working in the systems. They are clogging up systems, and that's been one of the kind of top problems in septic systems, needing clean outs and causing drain field problems because they float. And so, they don't sink down like the solids do. They can float and they don't break down. So they're causing a lot of problems in these systems. So you want to be sure that you're not flushing, the wipes, disinfectant wipes that you might use for cleaning, but also like cotton balls, paper towels, napkins, things like that. They really shouldn't go into the septic system. Organic debris is a huge source of nitrogen coming into our waterways. And where we see it most is in stormwater ponds. And that's what's pictured here, is a stormwater pond with a good algae mat on it. And you can see right here that we've got grass clippings sitting right on top of this algae mat feeding it. So grass needs nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium to grow, and that's what's in fertilizer bags. Those three numbers, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, are the three numbers on a bag. So grass clippings, whether fertilized or unfertilized, are pulling those nutrients from the soil. And when you cut them, cut the grass, those grass clippings are like little pieces of fertilizer because they contain those nutrients. And when they get into our water bodies, it's putting those nutrients into our water bodies. So it's actually feeding that algae right there. So grass clippings can be a huge source of nitrogen. Leaf litter, even bigger. We have done some research and found that communities that don't do street sweeping, allow all that leaf litter, especially this, certain times of year when the oak trees drop their leaves or deciduous trees drop their leaves, it ends up into the storm drains and out into the ponds. And we've seen huge amounts of nitrogen coming from leaf litter. So that's something that we need to address as a community. Better. We need to do better. Even compost can leach nitrogen. So a recommendation for turf grass, if your turf grass is doing poor, we're talking about putting compost down as kind of a top dressing. It's a recommendation sometimes. It's a recommendation to use compost in your beds. And that's all great. And yes, it does improve soil health. So those are good things in the landscape, but always realize that your landscape and your waterways are connected, okay? So if you overwater, if we have a big rain event, whatever's in that landscape is going to be pushed out into the water. And so compost can leach some nitrogen. So using big amounts, putting in compost in a whole yard right up next to a water body, it may have a good nitrogen leach when it first goes in until it, gets it leached out. So this is a kind of a newer topic that we've been looking at for a few years now and finding out some kind of scary, interesting things. But pharmaceuticals and personal care products that end up in our water bodies. Again, that's not something that we've been regulating. It's not something that's really been looked at or tested in water. So a lot of pharmaceuticals are ending up in, higher concentrations in our water bodies. And, it gets really scary when our water bodies are drinking water. But one of our water researchers told me one time that there is not a body of water on this earth that doesn't have trace amounts of pharmaceutical in it. It's just everywhere now. So, Big Pharma is really good at marketing their products, and we're really good at taking them. I know I was taking ibuprofen a lot instead of trying to figure out what the cause of my problem was. I would get headaches, and it was easy just to pop an ibuprofen instead of, really sitting down and figuring out what the problem was. So if we can work on ways to try to reduce what we take in so it doesn't come out and into our water bodies, would be great. I'm not saying don't take your medication. Definitely take your medication, but don't take medication that is maybe not as necessary. Like I said, with the ibuprofen, it was just easier sometimes to take that than to go and figure out what the root cause of the problem was. It is interesting that caffeine is one of the number one things that's in our bodies of water. And it's not just coffee. These energy drinks have really high levels of caffeine. And so a lot of people are drinking more and more energy drinks, which is driving that up. Oh, I meant to talk about on this, what can you do? So what can you do about the personal care products and pharmaceuticals that are ending up in our wastewater? Well, one is make sure you're disposing of them properly. The recommendation for disposal of pharmaceuticals is to, even in the same container that they come in, just removing the label so your personal information is not in there, and then putting coffee grounds and some water in the bottle. And what this does is it breaks down the medication so that it's not in a tablet form, and the coffee grounds are supposed to make it undesirable to animals that might get into your garbage. So then you throw that container into your garbage, and then it goes, into the lined landfills instead of flushing them, which is what we used to always do with our old medicines, right? We used to just flush them. So please don't do that. There's also pharmacies that will do collections sometimes. Sometimes, there's other entities that will do collections. Just be sure you're pulling off your personal information before you're turning that stuff in. But please dispose of your medications properly. That's a big help in that system or that issue. So for water quality issues, feel free to contact me if you have any questions. I'd love to hear from you. And thank you. Thank you for being interested in protecting our Florida water resources and going through this Sustainable Floridians program.